He pulled the divorce papers from his jacket pocket and dropped them onto the table in front of her like they were a restaurant check. Not handed, dropped. Grant Waverly didn't look up from his phone when he did it. Marissa was beside him, her perfume so thick it reached Vivian before the papers did, laughing at something on her own screen while Vivian sat across from both of them in the conference room of Harlow and Bryce, one of Manhattan's oldest family law firms, and understood with sudden, terrible clarity that her husband had brought his mistress to their divorce signing, 22 years, and this was how it ended. If you've ever loved someone so much you forgot to keep loving yourself, if you've ever looked across a table and not recognized the life you built, this story is for you. Stay with us through every part of this one, because what happens next is going to make you want to stand up and cheer. Like the video and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. You will not want to miss what comes next. The conference room was on the 14th floor, all glass and pale wood, the kind of room designed to make difficult things feel civilized. It wasn't working. Vivian Hale, she had already decided to take her maiden name back the moment the ink dried, sat with her hands flat on the table and looked at the papers. Her attorney, a compact woman named Deanna Cross, who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain, had already reviewed every clause. There was nothing to negotiate. Vivian had stopped negotiating 8 months ago when she'd come home from a charity benefit to find Marissa's overnight bag on the chair in her own bedroom and Grant asleep in his clothes, unbothered, like a man who'd long since stopped caring whether he got caught. That night, Vivian had sat in her car in the parking garage beneath their building for 2 hours. Not crying, just sitting, trying to figure out when exactly she had become invisible in her own life. Now she picked up the pen. Grant still hadn't looked at her. "You don't have to read it again," he said. He was scrolling through his phone with his thumb, casual as a man checking sports scores. "Deanna's had it for 3 weeks. There's nothing new." Vivian didn't answer. She read the first page slowly, the way she'd taught herself to read anything important. Her father had told her once, "You don't sign your name to something you haven't fully understood," and she'd kept that longer than she'd kept most of the advice people gave her. Marissa reached across Grant to refill her water glass, and her elbow nearly knocked his coffee. He caught it without looking up. They had that ease together, the unconscious physical grammar of two people who'd been sharing space long enough that the other's movements were already inside them. Vivian recognized it because she and Grant had moved like that once. She signed the last page. Deanna slid the folder closed and said quietly, "That's it." Grant put his phone in his pocket and finally looked at Vivian. There was something in his face, not guilt exactly, more like the mild relief of a man who's finished a project that ran longer than he wanted. "I think this is the right thing," he said, "for both of us." Vivian picked up her bag. "I know you do." She didn't say anything else. She'd stopped trying to make him understand what he'd cost her. Some people were genuinely incapable of grasping the weight of what they'd taken from another person, and Grant Waverly was one of them. He'd been raised in a world where apologies were transactional and damage was what happened to other people. She walked out of the conference room and into the hallway and pressed the elevator button and waited, breathing steadily, the way she breathed through anything hard. She had not broken. She was going to make sure that meant something. The elevator opened. She stepped in. Through the closing doors, she could hear Marissa's laugh, bright and unselfconscious, already rolling back into the room like everything had gone exactly according to plan. It had. Just not according to theirs. Vivian came out of the building onto 43rd Street and turned toward the parking structure 2 blocks north. The November air was raw. She'd forgotten her gloves and her hands were cold, and she was thinking about the drive home, the specific silence of her apartment, the fact that she had the leftover Thai food from last night, and absolutely no interest in eating it. She was thinking about ordinary things because ordinary things were what you held on to when something large and irrevocable had just occurred. And then her phone buzzed, a text from a number she didn't recognize. The courthouse rooftop. 20 minutes. Come alone. She stopped walking. She stood on the sidewalk with people flowing around her, everyone in coats and earphones, everyone with somewhere to be, and she read the text again. Her first instinct was to ignore it. Her second was to show it to Deanna. Her third, and this was the one that surprised her, was that she wasn't afraid. She was curious. That was new. 8 months of a slow-motion collapse had put her so deep inside survival mode that she'd forgotten what curiosity felt like. It felt like standing at the edge of something, not looking down but looking out. She typed back, "Who is this?" The response was immediate. "Someone who's been watching what they did to you and what you're about to do about it." The courthouse was 4 blocks away. She walked. She didn't take the elevator to the rooftop. She took the stairs, which were concrete and badly lit, and smelled like industrial cleaner and the particular staleness of spaces that were functional and nothing else. Her heels were wrong for it. She didn't care. She pushed through the door at the top and stepped into the cold. The rooftop was wide and flat, bounded by a low concrete parapet, the city spreading out in all directions, towers and water tanks, and the gray November sky pressing down on all of it. A helicopter sat at the far end, rotors still, black against the pale sky. She had not expected the helicopter. 2 men stood near the stairwell door she'd come through. They were large and still, and they looked at her the way security personnel looked at things, with complete attention and no readable expression. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them moved to stop her. She walked toward the helicopter. A man stood beside it with his back to her, looking out at the city. He wore a dark overcoat, no hat. When she was about 15 feet away, he turned, and Vivian recognized him the way she would have recognized the Statue of Liberty. Not from personal acquaintance, but from the specific quality of attention the world had paid to his face. Adrian Vale. She'd seen him in news photographs, in the background of congressional hearing footage, in the kind of investigative journalism pieces that were always careful about what they directly stated. He was 46 or 47, dark-haired, with a stillness about him that didn't read as calm so much as it read as chosen. A man who had decided long ago how much of himself to give to any given moment and never gave more. He looked at her without any of the theater she'd expected. No performance of menace, no deliberate pause to establish dominance. He just looked at her, the way you looked at someone you actually wanted to understand. "Ms. Hale," he said. "It's going to be Hale again as of about 40 minutes ago," she said. "Not Waverly." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "I know. You know a lot, apparently. I know that your husband brought his girlfriend to your divorce and spent most of it on his phone." He said it without heat, just the flat weight of a fact. "I know that the Waverly Foundation hasn't been audited internally in 11 years. I know that 3 of your husband's board members have been looking for a reason to move against him for the last 2 years and haven't had the leverage." She was quiet for a moment. Wind moved across the rooftop and she felt it in her hair. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're the only one who can use it," he said. "You were inside that marriage. You know things you don't know you know yet." "And what do you get?" He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was the same, level, unhurried, no particular color to it. "I don't like men who steal from sick children." She held his eyes. "That's a specific thing to know." "I've been specific about Grant Waverly for about 18 months. The wind came again. Below them, the city moved on in its ordinary way, yellow cabs and delivery bikes, and the sound of a siren several blocks north. Vivian thought about the overnight bag on the chair. She thought about sitting in the parking garage for 2 hours. She thought about the papers she'd just signed and the way Grant hadn't looked at her until he needed to. "What exactly are you proposing?" she said. "Nothing you don't choose," he said. "That's the first thing. You walk away from this roof right now, you never hear from me again. Everything I know, I sit on. Your ex-husband keeps his foundation, and his girlfriend, and his reputation. That's one option. And the other? You let me offer you resources. An attorney. A real one, not a divorce lawyer. A forensic financial attorney. Access to information my people have collected. Security, if it becomes necessary. And you do what you were already planning to do." She stared at him. "How do you know what I was planning?" "You didn't cry," he said. "I had someone watching the courthouse today. You came out of that building and you weren't crying. You weren't looking at your phone for someone to call. You were thinking." A pause. "Women who are broken go home. Women who are angry go home and pour a drink. Women who are planning something walk 4 blocks in the wrong direction in heels that aren't made for stairs." She looked at him for a long time. You followed me to the stairwell? I had someone make sure you made it to the roof safely, he said. There's a difference. It was not a small distinction, and she registered that he'd made it. I want to be clear about something, she said. I'm not interested in anyone managing this for me. Not you, not anyone. I understand. I mean it. I spent 22 years in a marriage where a man decided what my life looked like. I'm not trading one of those arrangements for another. He nodded once. Not the nod of someone conceding a point, the nod of someone who had already understood it and was waiting for her to arrive there herself. What I'm offering is not management, he said. It's infrastructure. You drive. I just know where the roads are. She turned and looked out at the city. The sky had the low gray weight of a day that was going to stay cold. She thought about the text she'd received from a stranger on a sidewalk, and how she'd chosen to follow it up 4 flights of stairs instead of ignoring it, and what that told her about where she was. She was done being quiet in a way that cost her everything. I'll want to speak to the attorney first, she said. Alone, before I agree to anything. Her name is Leona Price, he said. She'll be at your apartment tonight if you want her there. Vivian turned back to him. You were that certain I'd say yes? The corner of his mouth moved again. No, he said. I just know she's available. She didn't go home right away. She went to a coffee shop on 46th Street, the kind of place with no Wi-Fi signs and mismatched chairs, and she ordered a black coffee and sat in the back corner and opened the small notebook she'd been keeping for 3 months. It was a physical notebook, spiral-bound, the kind you bought at a drugstore. She'd started it when she understood, really understood in her body, and not just her head, that she was going to need to remember things. Dates, amounts, names she'd overheard in phone calls she wasn't supposed to hear. The name of the resort project Grant had mentioned once and never mentioned again. The number of times he'd come home from the foundation with the particular look of a man who'd been handling something he couldn't talk about. She'd kept it because she didn't know yet what she was building, only that she was building something. She read through it slowly, the way she'd read the divorce papers. Then she got out her phone and searched Leona Price. The results came back immediately. Leona Price, partner at Greer Solo and Price. 43 years old, former federal prosecutor, Southern District of New York. Specialized in financial crimes, nonprofit fraud, and asset recovery. Had successfully prosecuted 2 sitting executives in the last 5 years. The kind of attorney whose name appeared in articles about cases rather than in profiles about herself. Vivian read for 20 minutes. Then she texted the unknown number. Tell her 8 o'clock. Leona Price arrived at 7:58. She was shorter than Vivian had expected, with close-cropped natural hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and a leather portfolio that looked like it had been through several major cases and hadn't been replaced because it still worked. She accepted coffee and sat at Vivian's kitchen table and opened the portfolio and said, without any preamble at all, tell me everything you know and then tell me everything you think you know, and we'll sort out which is which afterward. Vivian appreciated that. She got out the notebook. They worked until almost 1 in the morning. At some point, Leona took her glasses off the top of her head and put them on and stopped writing and looked at Vivian over the frames. The resort project, she said. You heard him on the phone. Twice, Vivian said. Maybe 3 times. He never said the name directly, but he said Eastfield. He said the Eastfield thing and then he changed rooms. Leona wrote something and circled it twice. And the amount he mentioned, the 7-figure number, he said by the end of the quarter. Vivian wrapped both hands around her mug. I thought it was an investment. I thought a lot of things were investments. Leona sat back. She had a way of going still when she was thinking that reminded Vivian of Adrian Vale. Except where his stillness was chosen, hers was simply the natural state of a brain that was working very fast and very privately. This isn't going to be quick, she said finally. This is going to be careful and quiet and take time. Can you do that? I've been doing it for 8 months, Vivian said. 8 months of staying still, Leona said. What I'm describing is 8 months of moving without being seen. That's different. But Vivian thought about the overnight bag, the parking garage, the 43rd floor, the rooftop, the stairs. Yes, she said. Leona closed the portfolio. Then we start tomorrow. A child. The news broke 3 days later. Not the investigation. That would take months. What broke was Adrian Vale himself, or rather, the fact of him. Someone, Vivian never learned who, had tipped off a photographer at the courthouse on the day of the divorce, and the image that came out was taken from an angle that made the helicopter look larger than it was. And Adrian Vale stepping out of it looked like something out of a film. He was looking directly at the camera, though whether deliberately or by accident was impossible to know with a man like that. The caption on the wire photo read, "Adrian Vale, reported head of the Vale Crime Network, arrives at Manhattan Courthouse following finalization of Waverly divorce." By evening, it was everywhere. Vivian was in Leona's office on Park Avenue when her phone started going off. She silenced it and put it face down on the table and kept going through the document Leona had placed in front of her. Leona watched her for a moment. "You know, every network in the country is going to be calling you by morning." "I know." "You don't seem upset about it." Vivian turned a page. "I spent 22 years being the woman in the background of Grant Waverly's photographs. Nobody called me then." She paused on a line, a specific number in a transfer record that Leona's contact had surfaced. "If they're talking about me now, it's because I'm interesting. I can live with interesting." Leona smiled very briefly and went back to her work. What neither of them said, because it didn't need to be said. The photograph was doing something else, too. In the specific ecosystem of New York, its money and its influence and its carefully maintained relationships between powerful people, the image of Adrian Vale walking into a courthouse for a woman named Vivian Hale was sending a message that no press release could have sent. It was saying, she is not alone. It was saying, whatever you think comes next, recalculate. In the lobby of the Waverly Foundation's Midtown offices, a senior board member named Theodore Marsh watched the news segment twice on his phone, then called his attorney. In his apartment on Central Park West, Grant Waverly poured 2 fingers of bourbon and stared at the image on his laptop screen and tried to understand what he was looking at. He had known Adrian Vale's name for years, the way everyone in his world knew it, with a careful distance, a studied indifference, the social agreement that one simply didn't involve oneself in conversations about the Vale Network's business unless one wanted to be involved in conversations about the Vale Network's business. What he had never once considered was the possibility that his wife, his quiet, manageable, 22 years of no-trouble wife, had any conceivable connection to that world. Marissa came to stand behind him and looked at the screen. "Is that who I think it is?" "Don't," Grant said. Grant, I said don't." He closed the laptop. The bourbon was warming his chest, and he focused on that, on the physical sensation of it, because the alternative was to begin thinking clearly about what it meant, and he wasn't ready to do that. He would be ready by morning. By morning, it would be too late. In a coffee shop on 46th Street at the corner table in the back, Vivian Hale sat with her notebook open and added one more entry and allowed herself carefully, quietly, one small, unfamiliar thing. She allowed herself to feel like the beginning of something. The notebook was still on the kitchen table when Vivian woke at 5:40 the next morning. She hadn't meant to sleep. She'd sat down on the couch after Leona left, still in her clothes, with the intention of going through the document one more time, and at some point the city noise had dropped below a certain threshold, and she'd gone under. She woke with the notebook's corner pressed into her cheek, and the particular grayness of a November dawn filling the windows, and the feeling, for exactly 3 seconds, that none of it had happened yet. Then she remembered. She sat up, rolled her shoulders, and went to make coffee. While the machine ran, she stood at the window and looked at the street below. A delivery truck idled in the crosswalk. A woman walked a terrier at a pace the terrier didn't agree with. The city was doing what it always did, which was to proceed, indifferent and continuous, and Vivian had always found something useful in that. Her phone had 47 notifications. She read none of them. She poured the coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and opened the notebook. There was a name on the last page she'd written last night, circled once, Eastfield Properties, LLC. It had taken Leona approximately 20 minutes to locate the incorporation filings. Registered in Delaware, 2019, One managing partner listed a man named Curtis Hain, who had served as a mid-level development coordinator for the Waverly Foundation until 2018. Leona had said, without looking up, he left the foundation 1 year before the LLC was incorporated. Vivian had said, that's not a coincidence. Leona had said, no, it's a structure. Now Vivian sat with the name and the coffee and thought about Grant in the way she hadn't let herself think about him for months. Not with anger, not with the particular cold grief of a marriage that had dissolved slowly enough that you didn't notice until you were already on the other side of it, but with something cleaner. Forensic. The way Leona looked at numbers. She thought 22 years. She thought, how long were you building this? She thought, and what else did I not know? Her buzzer sounded at 7:15. She pressed the intercom. Who is it? Package for Miss Hale. A voice she didn't recognize. Young, male, flat. Leave it at the desk. A pause. It's from Mr. Vale. She went down in the elevator and through the lobby. The doorman, Maurice, had already signed for it. A flat envelope, the kind used for legal documents. No return address. She took it upstairs and opened it at the kitchen table. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 6 names and 6 columns of numbers. No letterhead, no explanation. At the bottom, in handwriting that was small and deliberate and slightly left-leaning, board members, donation histories, cross-reference with foundation disbursement records for 2018 to 2022. LP has the disbursements. Vivian read it twice. Then she photographed it and sent the image to Leona. Leona's response came back in under 2 minutes. Already on it. Come in at 9. Use the side entrance on 47th. The side entrance on 47th Street opened into a narrow hallway that smelled like old carpet and the particular institutional warmth of a building that had been running its heat the same way since 1987. Leona's office was on the 8th floor and the elevator was slow. Vivian took the stairs. Leona was already there with 2 other people. A man named Dan Forsyth, who was introduced only as our forensic accountant, and who had the slightly unfocused look of someone who'd been awake since 3 a.m., and a woman named Rita, whose last name Vivian wasn't given, who sat against the wall with a laptop and a series of expressions that all amounted to intense concentration. Sit down, Leona said. We have a problem. Vivian sat. Which one? The Eastfield structure is more complicated than we thought. Leona turned the laptop toward her. On the screen was a flowchart. Boxes and arrows, LLCs nested inside LLCs, holding companies with addresses in 3 different states. Curtis Hain is real and he's on paper, but he's a cutout. The actual control structure goes through 2 more entities before you reach something that connects back to Waverly. Vivian looked at the chart. Connect it for me. Dan Forsyth leaned forward. He had the energy of a man who genuinely loved this kind of thing, which was both slightly unsettling and exactly what was needed. Eastfield Properties feeds into a parent company called Meridian Asset Holdings. Meridian has a silent partner arrangement with a private equity vehicle registered in Nevada. That vehicle, he tapped the screen, has 1 beneficial owner. The name on the filing is a trust. The trustee of record is an attorney named Philip Gorst. Vivian said, Grant's college roommate. Everyone looked at her. Philip Gorst, she said again. He was Grant's roommate at Dartmouth. They stayed close. He came to our house for dinner, maybe 6, 7 times. I haven't seen him in 4 years. She paused. Grant told me Philip had moved his practice to Florida. Leona's pen stopped moving. He didn't move to Florida. No, Vivian said. I can see that. The room was quiet for a moment. Rita typed something. Dan sat back and rubbed his eyes with both palms. The trust, Vivian said. Who are the beneficiaries? Leona and Dan exchanged a look. That's the part, Leona said carefully, that we're still working on. Trust documents at this level of structuring don't surface easily. What we have now is the shape of it. What we need is the interior. How long? Days. Maybe a week if the Delaware filings cooperate. Leona set her pen down. There's something else. Vivian waited. Someone called my office this morning, Leona said. Before I arrived. Whoever it was didn't leave a name. They left a message with my receptionist. She slid a yellow notepad across the table. The message was written in the receptionist's handwriting. Tell Miss Price that her new client should be careful about the company she keeps. Some associations carry costs that don't show up on a balance sheet. Vivian read it. She set the notepad back on the table. When was this? She said. 7:42. She thought about the envelope that had arrived at her building at 7:15. The timing was not accidental. Someone had watched the delivery and made a phone call. Is this meant to scare me, she said, or to scare you? Leona looked at her steadily. Probably both. The question is whether it works. Does it? Leona picked up her pen again. I prosecuted a sitting CFO who had 2 federal judges on his contact list and a brother-in-law in the mayor's office, she said. No. Vivian nodded. Then we keep going. Well, Grant Waverly did not sleep Tuesday night. He sat in his study on the 32nd floor with the city spread out below him and worked his phone in the way he'd worked it for 30 years, methodically, one contact at a time, taking the temperature of his world. What he found was troubling in a specific way, the way you found troubling when no one was saying anything directly, but the texture of conversations had changed. People were available, but slightly less so. Responses were prompt, but slightly more neutral. Theodore Marsh, who had sat on his board for 9 years and golfed with him 4 times a year, said he was incredibly slammed right now and would call back Thursday. He hadn't called back by Thursday in 10 years. They had lunch standing scheduled. Grant understood what he was feeling without wanting to name it. He'd grown up watching his father navigate similar moments, the quiet withdrawal of people who sensed which way a situation was moving and wanted to be on the right side of the distance. His father had told him once, "You can survive scandal if you move faster than the story. The men who fall are the ones who wait." He called Marissa into the study at 11 p.m. She came in her robe, holding a glass of wine, and stood in the doorway with the particular ease of a woman who had made herself at home very thoroughly in a very short time. Grant had found that attractive once. Tonight, it registered differently. "Tell me exactly what you know about Vivian and Adrian Vale," he said. Marissa blinked. "I don't know anything about that." "Think harder." She came into the room and sat on the arm of the leather chair. "Grant, I genuinely have never heard anything connecting them. I don't think Vivian even knew who he was." "She knew who he was." "I mean personally. Neither did I," he said. "That's the point." He turned back to the window. "Vale doesn't do anything without a reason. He doesn't show up at a courthouse on a Tuesday for a woman he doesn't have a use for." He paused. "That means Vivian has something I don't know about, or she knows something, or both." Marissa was quiet for a moment. "What does that mean for us?" He looked at her reflection in the glass. "It means you need to think very carefully," he said, "about anything you've done with my foundation's resources that I don't have a paper record of." The silence that followed had a specific quality. Marissa set her wine glass on the desk. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that if there's an investigation, which there may or may not be, I don't know yet. Investigators don't distinguish between the principal and the people around the principal. They look at anyone who had access, anyone who benefited." He turned to face her. "Did you benefit, Marissa?" Her face had changed. The ease was gone. What was under it was harder and less certain. "You told me those accounts were discretionary. You said the board approved the travel budget." "I said a lot of things." She stood up. "Grant, I'm not accusing you of anything," he said, in the voice he used in board meetings when he was absolutely accusing someone of something. "I'm asking you to think carefully about your exposure. That's all." "My exposure," she said. "You're talking to me about my exposure." "I'm trying to protect both of us." She picked up her wine glass. Her hand wasn't steady. "You're trying to protect yourself and you want to know if I'm a liability." He didn't answer. She walked out of the study. He listened to her heels on the hardwood and the particular sound of the guest bedroom door closing. Not slamming, which would have meant anger, but pulling quietly shut, which meant something she was keeping to herself. He turned back to the window. He'd deal with Marissa. He'd been dealing with difficult people his entire professional life. What concerned him more right now was Philip Gorst. Philip, who had not returned his call from this morning. Philip, who had a very specific set of documents and a very specific set of files that connected a very specific set of things that were not, by any standard accounting, supposed to be connected. He picked up his phone and called Philip again. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. Grant ended the call without leaving a message. Philip Gorst returned the call at 6 the next morning. Grant was already awake. He'd been awake since 4. "You saw the news," Grant said. "Everyone saw the news." Philip's voice was careful in a way that Grant didn't like. Philip had been careful in that specific way exactly twice before in 30 years. Both times, bad things had followed. "Grant, I need you to listen to me. I've been doing some thinking." "Philip, just listen." A pause. "The Meridian structure, the Nevada vehicle, the trust documents. If anyone starts pulling those threads..." "Nobody's pulling anything yet." "You don't know that." Philip's voice dropped. "You don't know what Vale's people have access to. The things that man's organization can get into. You have no idea. I've been in rooms with federal prosecutors who have no idea. If he's helping her, he's not helping her. He's making a statement. It's theater." The silence on the line had a texture to it. "Grant," Philip said very carefully, "I want to be your friend right now. I want to tell you something as your friend, as someone who has known you for 30 years. Another pause. "This is not theater." Grant sat with that. "What are you suggesting?" he said. "I'm suggesting that you consider what a proactive conversation with a prosecutor looks like compared to a reactive one." Philip's voice had gone very quiet. "I'm suggesting that the window for controlling this narrative is not unlimited." "Are you telling me you're going to..." "I'm telling you I'm thinking about my own situation," Philip said, "and I'm extending you the courtesy of telling you I'm thinking about it, so that you have time to think about yours." The call ended. Grant sat in his study with his phone in his hand and felt, for the first time in longer than he could account for, genuinely afraid. Not the social fear of embarrassment, not the professional fear of losing a board position, but the older and more physical fear of a man who understands that the ground beneath him is not solid and hasn't been for some time, and he is only now noticing. He thought about the children's surgical fund. He thought about the number. He thought about the emails that existed. He poured a drink at 6:15 in the morning and did not consider that unusual. Bang! Vivian didn't hear about the Philip Gorst call until 3 days later, when Leona came to her apartment with a look on her face that meant things had moved faster than expected. "He called a federal prosecutor," Leona said before she'd taken her coat off. "Southern District. He made contact yesterday afternoon. We have a source inside the building." Vivian set down her coffee cup. "He's going to cooperate?" "He's exploring it, which means he's scared enough to consider burning Grant to protect himself, which means he knows exactly what's in those trust documents, which means the structure is worse than we thought. The structure is a great deal worse than we thought." Leona finally took her coat off and hung it on the chair back. "Sit down. I'm going to tell you what Dan found overnight, and I want you to hear all of it before you react." Vivian sat. "The Nevada vehicle," Leona said, "is not just a holding company for the resort project. Over the past 4 years, it has received transfers totaling approximately $9.4 million. The origin of those funds," she paused, "traces back through 3 intermediary accounts to the Waverly Foundation's Children's Surgical Endowment." The room was very quiet. Vivian had known there was money missing. She had known in the abstract that Grant had been taking from the foundation, but the surgical endowment was specific. The surgical endowment was the fund that paid for children's heart operations. She had attended the gala that launched it. She had sat at the table while Grant gave a speech about legacy and responsibility, and she had felt proud of him the last time she would feel proud of him, and that had been 4 years ago, which meant he was already doing it when she was sitting at that table feeling proud. $9.4 million, she said. "Over 4 years, yes. From the Children's Fund." "From the Children's Fund." Vivian looked at her hands on the table. They were flat and still. She was aware of her own breathing. She was aware of a kind of anger that was different from what she'd felt in the conference room, different from what she'd felt in the parking garage. This was not personal. This had moved past personal. "Are there children," she said, "who didn't receive treatment because of this?" Leona's expression didn't change, but her eyes did. "We don't know yet. The endowment has other funding sources. It's possible the gap was covered without anyone realizing there was a gap. We're looking. Find out, Vivian said. That's the first thing, before anything else. Find out. I will. They sat with it for a moment. Then Vivian said, What does Vale know about this piece? Based on what I understand, Leona said carefully, his people have known about the surgical endowment connection for approximately 6 months. It's why he moved when he did. He waited, Vivian said. He waited for me to be out of the marriage first. Leona looked at her. Yes. Why? Because, Leona said, going after a sitting man's wife's ex-husband is a different thing than going after a man whose divorce was just finalized. One is a personal vendetta. The other is accountability. Vivian was quiet for a long time. He thought about the optics, she said. He thought about what would hold up, Leona said. There's a difference, but yes. Vivian stood up and went to the window. The city was doing its thing, continuous and indifferent. She put her palm flat against the glass and felt the cold coming through it. She had thought, when she walked out of the law firm on 43rd Street, that she understood what she was starting. She had been wrong. She had understood a piece of it, the marriage, the humiliation, the specific betrayal of a man who chose the wrong person and then refused to be honest about it. That part was comprehensible. That part had a shape. But $9.4 million from the fund that paid for children's heart surgeries was a different shape entirely. I want everything, she said to the window, to the city. Not just what holds up in court, everything. I want every dollar accounted for and every name on every document and every person who looked at those numbers and said nothing. She turned back to Leona. Can you do that? Yes, Leona said. It'll take time. How much time? 6 to 8 weeks to build the full picture. Then we decide how we bring it. Vivian nodded. Then we start the clock. She didn't know, standing there at the window, that the clock had already started. That in the lobby of the Waverly Foundation's offices on 54th Street, a woman named Marissa was sitting in her car in the underground parking structure. Not crying, not on her phone. Just sitting, thinking, with a thumb drive in her jacket pocket that had been sitting in the back of her desk drawer for 8 months. The way you kept something you weren't sure you'd need. Marissa had made a lot of calculations in her life. She was making one now. Marissa sat in that parking structure for 41 minutes. She knew because she watched the clock on her dashboard the entire time. Not obsessively, just the way you watched a clock when you were trying to make a decision and you needed to know how long you'd been making it. The thumb drive was in her jacket pocket. She could feel it the way you felt a small stone in a shoe, not painful, just consistently present, reminding you it was there. She had taken it from Grant's home office 14 months ago. She hadn't planned to. She'd been looking for a phone charger in his desk drawer and found the drive in a paper clip tray, unlabeled, the kind of drive you bought in a 10-pack and used once. She'd plugged it into her laptop out of pure curiosity, the specific curiosity of a woman who had been sleeping in another woman's bed for 2 years and still didn't know the full shape of the man she was sleeping next to. What was on it had taken her 3 days to understand. Spreadsheets, wire transfer confirmations, emails between Grant and Philip Gorst that were written in the shorthand of 2 men who trusted each other completely and had no reason to think anyone was reading. By the time she understood it, she had copied everything, put the original back in the paperclip tray, and said nothing. She'd kept it as insurance. That was the word she'd used to herself. Insurance. The word made it feel like something rational and adult, a contingency plan, the kind of prudent thinking that careful people practiced. It helped her not think about the other word, the more accurate one, which was leverage. But leverage over what? Over Grant, in case he ever turned on her? She hadn't imagined it would be anything else. She hadn't imagined a forensic attorney and a federal prosecutor and Adrian Vale's helicopter and $9.4 million from a children's surgical fund. She hadn't imagined any of the architecture of what was actually happening, because nobody tells the woman they're using about the full scope of the thing they're building. That was the part that had been sitting in her chest since Grant's voice in the study, steady and surgical. Think very carefully about your exposure. He had used her. He had let her sign things, be photographed at events, attend board dinners, authorize minor expenditures through accounts she now understood were connected to the Nevada vehicle. And he had done all of it with the full knowledge that if it ever came apart, She was standing close enough to the center to be inside the blast radius. She took the thumb drive out of her pocket and looked at it in the pale garage light. Then she took out her phone and searched Leona Price. Leona took the call at 8:40 that evening. Vivian was still at the kitchen table with the investigation document spread in front of her when Leona called, and she knew from the first two words, "We need," that something had shifted. "We need to meet," Leona said. "Tonight. Bring nothing. Just come." Vivian was in a cab within 4 minutes. Leona's office at 9 p.m. was different from Leona's office at 9 a.m. The building was quieter, the hallway lighting was lower, and Leona herself had the slightly stripped quality of someone who had been running on focus and caffeine since before dawn. Dan Forsyth was there again, but Rita wasn't. Instead, there was a woman Vivian had never seen. Mid-40s, dark blazer, the contained posture of someone trained to observe, sitting against the far wall with a yellow legal pad balanced on one knee. "This is Catherine Bale," Leona said. "She's with the Southern District." Vivian stopped. "Federal prosecutor. In Leona's office. Tonight." "Sit down," Leona said. Vivian sat. Catherine Bale didn't introduce herself more thoroughly than Leona already had. She looked at Vivian with the direct, neutrally appraising gaze of someone whose job required her to assess people quickly and without sentiment. "Ms. Hale, I want to be transparent with you about why I'm here. My office has been building a case involving the Waverly Foundation independently of your investigation. We've been doing it for 7 months. 2 days ago, we received contact from an attorney representing a potential cooperating witness." She paused. "And this afternoon, we received a call from a second individual who wants to discuss cooperation." Vivian looked at Leona. "Philip Gorst made contact 3 days ago," Leona said, "which we knew." "The second caller," she paused with the specific pause of someone delivering information they know will land hard, "was Marissa." The room didn't move. Vivian heard herself say, very evenly, "Marissa called a federal prosecutor." "She called my office directly," Catherine Bale said. "She says she has documentary evidence. A thumb drive she took from Grant Waverly's home office 14 months ago. She says it contains wire transfer records, email correspondence between Waverly and Philip Gorst, and internal spreadsheets mapping the diversion of funds from the Children's Surgical Endowment to the Eastfield and Meridian structures." Vivian looked at her hands on the table. 14 months ago. Marissa had been sitting on evidence for 14 months. While Vivian was living in that apartment, eating dinner at that table, going to those events, signing those divorce papers, Marissa had a thumb drive in a desk drawer that mapped the full criminal architecture of what Grant had been doing. "Is it real?" Vivian said. "The evidence." "We haven't verified the drive yet. She's meeting with us tomorrow morning with her attorney, but based on the description of its contents," Catherine Bale glanced at her legal pad, "it's consistent with what your forensic team has been building from the outside. If it holds up, it substantially compresses our timeline." "By how much?" "Weeks, potentially, instead of months." Vivian sat with that. She was aware of Leona watching her, not anxiously, just attentively, the way Leona watched everything, with the professional patience of a woman who had learned that people needed a moment before they said the useful thing. "She did this to protect herself," Vivian said. It was not a question.
"Almost certainly yes," Catherine Bale said. "That doesn't change the evidentiary value." "I know it doesn't." Vivian pressed her fingers flat on the table. "I'm not objecting. I'm just—" She stopped. What she was tired, in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. She was tired of the specific shape of this, the way everyone around Grant had been watching and calculating and protecting themselves while she was the one who had been living inside it without knowing the real dimensions of what she was living inside. "I need to ask you something," Vivian said to Catherine Bale. "The children, the surgical endowment, are there families who are currently—" "We have 2 cases flagged," Catherine Bale said. 2 children whose procedures were delayed due to funding gaps in the endowment over the past 18 months. One of those procedures has since been completed through an emergency funding bridge." A pause. "The bridge came from an anonymous charitable trust. We haven't been able to trace the origin." Leona said nothing. Vivian said nothing. She already knew. She texted Adrian from the cab on the way home. "The 2 children, the surgical delays. Was that you?"
His response came back 11 minutes later. The endowment had gaps. Gaps get filled. She stared at the message for a long time. Then she typed, "You didn't tell me." He replied, "It wasn't about you." She put the phone in her bag and looked out the cab window at the city going past, lit windows and wet pavement and the orange glow of traffic, and understood that she was dealing with a man whose moral arithmetic was genuinely different from anything she'd encountered. Not better, not worse. Different. He had replaced stolen money meant for sick children through untraceable means and not mentioned it to anyone, not as leverage, not as a demonstration of power, not even as information. Just done it and moved on. She didn't know how to feel about that. She filed it and moved on herself. The cab dropped her at her building at 10:20. Maurice held the door. She went upstairs. At 10:45, her phone rang from a number she recognized now, but it had called twice before, always blocked, always brief. She answered. Grant said, "We need to talk." His voice was different from any version of it she'd heard in the last year of their marriage. The surface confidence was gone. Not all of it. Grant Waverly had been building surface confidence for 4 decades, and it didn't strip away completely in a week, but enough of it that she could hear what was underneath, which was a man in the early stages of genuine fear. "There's nothing to talk about," she said. "Vivian," a pause. "I know about the federal prosecutor. I know Marissa called them." She was quiet. "Whatever she gave them," Grant said, "you need to understand that it's incomplete. She doesn't have the full context. The Eastfield structure was a bridge loan arrangement. It was always meant to be repaid. Grant. There are board minutes that support the intent. Grant." Her voice was flat. Not angry, flat, which was worse. "Stop." He stopped. "You took $9.4 million, she said, "from the fund that pays for children's heart operations. You ran it through 3 shell companies and a college friend's trust. You built a resort with it. You called it a bridge loan to yourself in your own head so you could sleep." She paused. "There are no board minutes. There is no context. There is an amount and a source and a destination and a very clear line between all 3. His breathing on the line was audible, short, not quite controlled. "I can make this right," he said. "I have the resources to—" "You don't." "To restore the full amount, plus interest, quietly, without—" "Grant." She shifted the phone to her other hand. "A federal prosecutor is building a criminal case. You don't make that right with a wire transfer. You make that right in a courtroom, in front of a judge, and the outcome of that is not something I control, or want to control." She paused. "Don't call me again." She ended the call. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for a while. Then she got up, went to the kitchen, poured a glass of water and drank it standing at the sink. Her hands were steady. She was mildly surprised by that. Not proud of it, just noting it, the way you noted weather. She had expected this call to feel like something large. Instead, it felt like the last echo of a sound that had already faded. She went back to the bedroom and was almost asleep when the second call came. Not from Grant, from a number she didn't know. She almost let it go. Some instinct made her answer. A woman's voice, low and fast. "Ms. Hale, you don't know me. My name is Sylvie Okafor. I'm a former program officer at the Waverly Foundation. I left in 2021 and I signed an NDA on my way out. And I have been sitting on what I know for 3 years because I have 2 kids and a mortgage, and I was afraid." A breath. "I'm not afraid anymore." "I need to talk to someone." Vivian sat up. "How did you get this number?" she said. "A man named Adrian Vale has very organized people," Sylvie said. "I'm sorry for calling so late. I know it's late, but I've been trying to decide all day and I needed to do it before I talked myself out of it again." "What do you know?" Vivian said. A pause. "I know the endowment wasn't the only fund they touched. I know because I found it in 2020, and I brought it to the deputy director, a man named Ross Calder, and Ross Calder sat across from me at his desk and told me I had misread the accounting classifications. He told me to drop it. A week later, I was given a performance review that was significantly worse than my previous 4 years of reviews. 3 months after that, I was offered a settlement and an NDA. Vivian's hand had tightened on the phone without her registering it. "Which other funds?" "The Youth Education Grant Program," Sylvie said. "And the Maternal Health Initiative." "Those 2.
plus the surgical endowment, over 6 years. Her voice dropped lower. Ms. Hale, I have the original spreadsheet, the one I found in 2020 before they knew I'd seen it. I made a copy. I've had it in a safety deposit box for 3 years. The surgical endowment was $9.4 million. The youth education program and the maternal health initiative together were larger, had been running longer.
Vivian did the rough arithmetic and felt something cold and precise settle in her chest. Can you come to New York? She said. I'm already here, Sylvie said. I drove up this afternoon. Button. They met at 6 the next morning at a diner on 9th Avenue that Vivian had chosen because it opened early and had booths with high backs and was the kind of place where nobody looked at anyone else. Sylvie Okafor was 38, with the compressed, self-contained energy of someone who had been holding something heavy for a long time and had finally put it down and wasn't sure yet how to stand without the weight of it. She was carrying a canvas tote bag. She ordered coffee and didn't touch it. She slid the envelope across the table before she said anything else. Vivian opened it. Inside was a printout, 12 pages, columns of numbers with fund codes she was starting to recognize. She read the first 3 pages without looking up. Then she looked up. Ross Calder, she said. He's still deputy director. He was promoted, Sylvie said, to executive director in 2022. She wrapped both hands around her untouched coffee cup. I watched it happen from the outside. He covered for Grant. He got promoted. I signed an NDA and went home to my kids. Her jaw tightened. The NDA covers the foundation's internal processes. My attorney says it doesn't cover criminal conduct. It specifically doesn't cover that. Your attorney is right, Vivian said. I know. Sylvie looked at her directly for the first time since they'd sat down. I need you to understand something. I'm not doing this for you. I don't know you. I'm not doing it for the investigation or the prosecutors or... She stopped. Started again. My niece had a congenital heart defect. She had surgery when she was 4. Her parents had nothing, and the procedure was covered by a charitable endowment. Not this one. A different one. But when I found those numbers in 2020, I thought about her every single night for a year, and I still didn't do anything because I was afraid and I will have to live with that. Her voice was level and quiet and carried no appeal for sympathy, which made it more affecting than any appeal could have. I'm not going to live with it anymore. Vivian held the woman's gaze. What do you need from me? I need to know my kids are safe, Sylvie said, while this is happening. I need to know that if Grant Waverly's people figure out who talked, my family is protected. I can arrange that, Vivian said. Sylvie looked at her. Vale's people. Yes. A long pause. Sylvie picked up her coffee, finally, and drank. Okay, she said. By 9 that morning, Leona had the spreadsheet. By 10, she had Sylvie on the phone with Catherine Bale's office. By 11, Dan Forsyth had cross-referenced Sylvie's 2020 document against the Foundation's public filings for the years in question and found 17 discrepancies that the public filings had papered over with reclassification so minor they would have been invisible to anyone not looking for them. Ross Calder's name appeared in 4 of the internal emails Marissa's thumb drive contained. The case was no longer about Grant Waverly and a resort project. It had become something with more mass and more velocity and considerably more people inside it. Leona called Vivian at noon and said, Catherine Bale's office is moving to a grand jury. The timeline is no longer 6 to 8 weeks. She told me this morning. How long? Vivian said. She said to be ready. Vivian stood in the middle of her kitchen in the gray December light with the phone against her ear and understood that ready was the operative word. Ready was not the same as prepared. Ready was what you were when you'd stopped trying to predict the shape of something and started trusting your ability to meet it. Tell her we're ready, she said. She put the phone down and stood there for a moment. Then she picked it up again and called Adrian. He answered on the second ring. She never knew where he was when he answered. She'd stopped trying to map his geography. Sylvie Okafor has 2 children, she said. She needs protection starting today. Not visible, not heavy, just reliable. It's already arranged, he said. She closed her eyes briefly. You knew she was going to call me.
I knew she was considering it, he said. I didn't know what she'd decide.
But you arranged protection before she decided. A pause. I arranged it for her kids, he said, regardless of what she decided. Vivian stood in the December light and said nothing for a moment. You're a complicated person, she said finally. Yes, he said, not with any false modesty, not with pride. Just the clean acknowledgement of a fact. The case is moving faster than anyone expected, she said. Bale's office is going to a grand jury. I know, he said. She almost asked how. She didn't. She was learning slowly which questions had useful answers and which ones were simply the habit of needing to know everything, a habit she was working on releasing because it had never once given her the control she thought it would. Is there anything, she said, that's going to come out in that grand jury that surprises me? A pause, longer than his pauses usually were. Grant, he said, has a second attorney, not Philip Gorst, someone you've never heard of. He's been retained in the last 72 hours. Another pause. This attorney specializes in witness intimidation cases. Defense side. Vivian went still. He's going to go after the witnesses. He's going to try to establish that the witnesses have credibility problems. Marissa's involvement with Grant, Sylvie's NDA, Philip Gorst's own exposure. A pause. And you. Me. Your relationship with me, Adrian said. He's going to argue that this investigation was orchestrated by an organized crime figure for personal reasons, and that you are either knowingly or unknowingly serving as the public face of a criminal enterprise's vendetta against a private citizen. The room was very quiet. Vivian understood what she was hearing. Grant's attorney was going to take the photograph, the helicopter, the courthouse, Adrian walking across a rooftop, and turn it into the story. Not the money, not the children, not the NDA and the spreadsheet and the shell companies. The story would become a mafia boss used a bitter divorcee to destroy a philanthropist, and everything else was constructed around that narrative to give it the appearance of legitimacy. It was, she recognized with cold clarity, not a stupid strategy. It was in fact the one thing that could genuinely threaten everything they had built. Because the evidence was real, the witnesses were real, the money trail was real. But juries were human, and humans responded to narratives. And the narrative of a powerful criminal organization orchestrating a takedown was graspable and dramatic in a way that spreadsheets and wire transfers were not. Grant's attorney knew that. Grant knew that. He had been in rooms with powerful people his entire life, and he understood how to make a room see what he needed it to see. He's going to put me on trial instead of Grant, she said. He's going to try, Adrian said, which means the next decision you make is the most important one you've made so far. She already knew what it was. She had known it since she'd heard his voice on the phone, flat and deliberate, laying it out. I have to be willing to stand in that courtroom, she said. Myself. Not through Leona, not through the investigation. Me, in front of a judge, and explain exactly what I know, and how I know it, and why I did what I did. Yes, he said, and if I do that, I have to be willing to answer questions about you. Yes. She looked at the window, the city. She thought about 22 years. She thought about the parking garage. She thought about 2 children whose surgeries were delayed because a man had moved money from their fund to build a resort, and a woman who had known and said nothing for 3 years because she was afraid, and another woman who had kept a thumb drive for 14 months because she didn't know yet what she was. She thought about who she was. I'll do it, she said. Adrian was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was the same as it always was. Level, without excess. You understand that testifying about your contact with me. I understand exactly what it means, she said. I'm going to say what's true. You offered me resources, and I used them to expose a man who stole from children. If a jury decides that disqualifies the evidence, then that's the jury's decision, and I'll live with it. A pause. But I'm not going to lie. Not about any of it. Not about you, not about what I knew, not about when I knew it. The silence stretched out between them. Vivian, he said. It was the first time he had used her first name. She noted it the way she noted everything, carefully, without making more of it than it was. What? She said. Nothing, he said. Just a pause. And in the pause she heard something that was not quite what she expected from him, not quite the chosen stillness, something fractionally less controlled. Just noting it, he said. What you just said. She understood. She didn't make him explain it. I'll call Leona, she said. She needs to know about the new attorney. She already knows, he said. I had someone tell her 20 minutes ago. Vivian almost laughed. Of course you did. She ended the call. She stood in the kitchen for a long moment. Then she went to the table and picked up the spiral notebook, the drugstore one, the one she'd been keeping for months. She turned to the last page with writing on it and looked at it. Then she turned to the next blank page and wrote one line, the way she'd been taught to write anything important, clearly, completely, without hedging. Whatever happens next, I already told the truth. She closed the notebook. Outside the window, the city moved on, continuous and indifferent, and for the first time since she had sat in a parking garage and tried to understand what her life had become. That indifference felt not like abandonment, but like the specific, impersonal freedom of a world that did not require her to be small inside it. The grand jury was seated on a Thursday. Vivian found out through Leona, who called at 7:40 in the morning with the flat efficiency she used when things were moving, and there was no time for anything except the next step. Catherine Bale's office filed this morning 23 counts: wire fraud, money laundering, breach of fiduciary duty, obstruction. That last one covers Ross Calder separately. Grand jury convenes at 2 p.m. I need you in my office at 10. Vivian was already dressed. She'd been up since 5. She hadn't been sleeping past 5 for 2 weeks. I'll be there at 9:30, she said. She arrived at 9:20. Leona was on the phone when she walked in and pointed at the chair across from her desk without interrupting her call. Dan Forsyth was at the side table with 3 laptops open, which was one more than usual. The yellow legal pad on Leona's desk had been written on so thoroughly that the pages were curled at the edges. Leona ended the call and sat down and said, Grant's attorney filed a motion this morning to delay the grand jury on procedural grounds. Bale's office rejected it within the hour. He then filed an emergency motion alleging prosecutorial misconduct based on the alleged involvement of organized crime in the origination of the investigation. Vivian said, That was fast. He filed it at 6 a.m., Leona said. He had it prepared before the grand jury was officially announced, which means he knew the timeline before we did. The room was quiet for a moment. Dan Forsyth didn't look up from his laptops. Someone inside the Southern District, he said, to no one in particular. Doesn't have to be high up. A clerk, a paralegal, someone who knew the filing schedule. Leona said, We're not going to chase that right now. What we're going to do is focus on what the motion means practically. She looked at Vivian. The misconduct allegation specifically names you and your contact with Adrian Vale. It argues that the investigation was initiated at Vale's direction, that the witnesses, Marissa, Sylvie Okafor, Philip Gorst, were located or approached through Vale's network, and that you served as the nominally civilian face of what is functionally a criminal organization's legal offensive against a private citizen. Is the motion going to succeed? Vivian said. No, Leona said, but it doesn't need to succeed. It needs to create enough noise to shift the public narrative before the grand jury finishes its work. Grant's attorney is not trying to win in court this morning. He's trying to win on television by tonight. Vivian understood this. She had understood it since Adrian had laid it out on the phone 3 days ago. Understanding it hadn't made it easier to sit with, but she had stopped expecting difficult things to be easy to sit with. You sat with them, or you didn't. She was sitting. What do I need to do? She said. Leona looked at her steadily. Nothing yet. Let the grand jury run. Bale's team is solid and the evidence is overwhelming. Between the thumb drive, Sylvie's spreadsheet, Philip Gorst's cooperation, and Dan's forensic reconstruction, we have more than enough for indictment. The question is what Grant does between now and indictment. He panics, Vivian said. He's already panicking, Leona said. The question is what panicking looks like for a man with his resources. Attack. What it looked like, it turned out, was a press conference. Grant held it at 2:30 in the afternoon in the lobby of the Waverly Foundation's Midtown offices, standing in front of the organization's logo. The stylized open hand that had been on the letterhead of every gala invitation, every annual report, every check made out to a cause that Grant Waverly wanted people to see him supporting. Vivian watched it on Dan's laptop with the sound low. Grant looked composed. That was the first thing. He looked like a man who had decided that composed was the register he was going to inhabit and had committed to it completely. Dark suit, no tie, the studied informality of a man trying to look like someone who had nothing to hide. He read from a prepared statement and then took questions, and his attorney, a man named Clark Dennison, who was known in New York legal circles for his ability to make complicated financial crimes sound like bookkeeping disagreements, stood just off his right shoulder the way a large dog stood near someone it was guarding. He said the words orchestrated campaign 4 times in 11 minutes. He said organized crime twice. He said my former wife in a tone that carried, precisely calibrated, the suggestion of a man who was grieving rather than defending. When a reporter asked about the children's surgical endowment, Grant said the funds in question were part of a bridge loan arrangement authorized by the Foundation's investment committee, that the full amount had been scheduled for return, and that the characterization of the arrangement as fraudulent was both false and defamatory. Vivian watched his face when he said it. She had lived with that face for 22 years. She knew the specific quality of his eyes when he was managing a room versus when he was telling the truth. He was managing. "Turn it off," she said. Dan closed the laptop. Leona's phone buzzed. She looked at it and said, "Catherine Bale." She took the call in the hallway. She came back 3 minutes later. "The grand jury has enough," she said. "They're moving forward. Indictment within 48 hours. The indictment came in 31. It came at 8:17 the following morning, and it was 26 counts, 3 more than originally filed because the grand jury had found sufficient basis to add charges related to the obstruction of Sylvie Okafor's 2020 internal report and Ross Calder's role in facilitating it. Ross Calder was indicted separately, simultaneously, at his home in Westchester, where 2 federal agents and a U.S. Marshal waited while his wife stood in the kitchen doorway in her bathrobe with the specific expression of a woman who had long suspected something was wrong and had just been proven right in the worst possible way. Grant Waverly surrendered voluntarily at 10 a.m. through Clark Dennison's office, which was the controlled, managed, PR-conscious way of doing it that allowed Dennison to put out a statement saying his client was fully cooperating and looked forward to clearing his name in court. The photograph from the surrender, Grant in the dark suit, stone-faced, Clark Dennison beside him, ran on every news site within the hour. Vivian was not watching any of it. She was at her kitchen table with the notebook and a cup of cold coffee that she kept forgetting to drink, going through her own testimony preparation for the 3rd time when her buzzer sounded. She wasn't expecting anyone. She pressed the intercom. Silence. Then, quiet and unmistakable. "It's me. Adrian." She buzzed him up. He came through the door the way he entered any space, with complete attention, nothing wasted. He was in a dark coat, no tie, and he looked at her the way he'd looked at her on the rooftop the first day, with the direct, unhurried quality of someone genuinely trying to see what was actually in front of them. "You didn't call," she said. "I was in the building," he said. "I wanted to see how you were." She looked at him. "You own this building." A pause. "I have an interest in the management company," he said. "That's different." "It's not that different." He held her gaze. "No," he said. "It's not." She went to the kitchen and poured the cold coffee down the drain and started a fresh cup. He sat at the table, but not taking up the chair across from hers, but the one at the end, as if he understood without being told which seat was hers. She appreciated that without mentioning it. "Dennison is going to put you on the stand," he said. "Not bail. Dennison, defense subpoena. He's going to call you as a hostile witness and spend 2 hours establishing that everything you know, because I told you." She turned to face him. "I know. If you go up there and you tell the truth about our arrangement, I'm going to tell the truth," she said. "Vivian." His voice was the same as always, but there was something underneath it, something that had been there since the phone call when he'd said her name and then said just noting it. She recognized it now for what it was. If you describe our arrangement accurately in that courtroom, Dennison will spend the next week feeding the media a story about me that will be 90% accurate and 100% damaging. I know that too. My organization operates in a specific balance, he said. Federal attention at this level, sustained, public. I know what it costs you, she said. I've known since you laid out the risk 3 days ago. She brought 2 cups of coffee to the table and set one in front of him and sat in her chair. I'm still going to tell the truth, because if I lie or omit or manage my testimony to protect you, then I'm doing exactly what everyone in Grant's orbit did for 6 years while children didn't get their surgeries. I become the same thing. She held his eyes. I'm not going to be the same thing. He was quiet for a long time. You could have called Leona without calling me, he said, the day after the divorce. You had enough from the notebook alone to start an investigation without ever going to that rooftop. Probably, she said. Why didn't you? She thought about it honestly. Because I was curious, she said, and because I was tired of being careful. I'd been careful for 22 years, and I had nothing to show for it except a signed divorce agreement and an overnight bag that wasn't mine on my bedroom chair. She looked at him. I went up those stairs because I decided I was done making small choices. He looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up the coffee and drank and set it down and said, The testimony. When Dennison puts you on the stand, he's going to try to rattle you. He's good at it. He finds the thing that feels like shame, and he leans on it until you either get angry or go quiet, and either way, he's got what he wants. What's my shame in his version of this? That you traded one man's control for another's. He said it directly, without softening it. He'll frame it that way. Abused wife flees manipulative husband, immediately runs into the arms of a mafia boss who tells her what to do. Same pattern, different man. That's his thesis. Vivian held the coffee cup in both hands. And what do I say to that? You tell me, he said, because I'm not going to put words in your mouth. She sat with it. The argument had a surface logic. She could see it clearly enough, could see exactly how Dennison would build it, the progression of questions, the careful framing, the slight pause before each key phrase to let it settle in the jury's hearing. She also knew, in a way that went past argument, that it was wrong. Not wrong in a legal sense, wrong in the actual sense. I'll tell them, she said slowly, that you offered resources and I used them, that you never told me what to investigate or what to conclude or who to talk to, that Leona Price, who has been a federal prosecutor and has never worked for anyone's crime network, ran the investigation, that the witnesses came forward on their own, that the evidence exists independent of any of it. She paused. And I'll tell them that if a woman leaving a bad marriage accepting help from an imperfect person disqualifies the truth, then you've set a standard for victimhood that no victim can ever meet. The kitchen was very quiet. Adrian put his cup down with the deliberate care of a man keeping his hands occupied. You're going to be fine in that courtroom, he said. I know, she said. She wasn't being arrogant. She was being accurate. The trial began on a gray January Monday that felt like every gray January Monday that had ever preceded something irrevocable. Vivian dressed carefully, not performatively, not with the self-consciousness of someone dressing for a verdict, but with the specific attention you gave to things that mattered. Dark blue. Simple cut. Her mother's watch, which she never wore because it was fragile and old and she was afraid of losing it, and which she put on today because she decided that fragile things deserve to be worn rather than protected into irrelevance. She sat in the gallery, not the stand, for the first 4 days. She watched Catherine Bale build the government's case with the particular beauty of a completely organized mind, document by document, witness by witness, each piece placed with the precision of someone who had been arranging this specific architecture for 7 months and knew exactly which stone went where. The wire transfers, the Eastfield structure, the Nevada vehicle. Philip Gorst, who looked diminished on the stand, smaller than he had been in the photographs Vivian had found of him, answering every question in the flat monotone of a man who had already bargained his way to reduce charges and was now paying the installments. Marissa testified on the 3rd day. She came in wearing a gray suit and no jewelry, and she sat in the witness box with her hands in her lap, and she answered Catherine Bale's questions with a directness that Vivian hadn't expected. She was not performing remorse. She was not performing anything. She was a woman who had made a calculation and was living inside it, and the calculation was that honesty now was the only currency she had left with any value. When Bale asked her why she had kept the thumb drive, Marissa paused for exactly 1 second and said, "Because I knew what he was capable of, and I knew that eventually I was going to need to be able to prove what I knew." Bale said, "And why now? Why come forward now?" Marissa looked at her hands. "Because he threatened me," she said. "In his study, the night after the news broke. He sat there and he told me to think about my exposure. He said it like he was doing me a favor." She looked up. "He used me the same way he used everything else. And I let him, for a long time. I'm not asking anyone to feel sorry for me about that. I'm just done letting him." Vivian watched Grant's face during Marissa's testimony. He sat at the defense table with Clark Dennison, and he looked at Marissa with the expression of a man watching something break that he once valued. Not grief, not anger. The precise, controlled assessment of someone calculating the damage. He felt Vivian watching and turned. Their eyes met across the courtroom. She held it. She didn't look away, didn't soften it, didn't give him the small mercy of a readable expression. She simply looked at him the way you looked at something you were finished being afraid of. He looked away first. Clark Dennison called Vivian to the stand on the 5th day. She had known it was coming, and she had prepared for it the way she'd prepared for everything over the past 2 months, by going through it until the preparation itself was unnecessary, until she knew it well enough that she didn't need to think about it, only to be present inside it. She walked to the stand and sat and looked at Dennison. He was tall, silver-haired, with the particular ease of a man who had spent decades in courtrooms and had made his peace with the theater of it. He smiled at her. Not warmly, professionally, the smile that meant, "I'm going to be reasonable with you, and I hope you'll be reasonable with me," and began. He started with the timeline. When had she first made contact with Adrian Vale? What were the terms of their arrangement? Who had initiated it? Had she received financial compensation? Had she received any material benefit? She answered each question directly and completely. She didn't hedge. She didn't qualify more than the truth required. Leona had told her, "Give him the sentence. Don't give him the paragraph." She gave him the sentence every time. He moved to the witnesses. Had she been aware that Vale's network was the source of Sylvie Okafor's contact information? Yes. Had she been aware that physical security had been arranged for Okafor's family through Vale's organization? Yes. "So witnesses who testified in this case against my client," Dennison said, with the measured cadence of a man placing the last brick in a wall, "were located through the network of an organized crime figure. And at least one of those witnesses was under the physical protection of that same criminal organization while she testified. Is that accurate?" "Sylvie Okafor came forward on her own," Vivian said. "She called me. The security for her children was arranged without my knowledge, before she made her decision to cooperate." "But you were aware of it." "I became aware of it, yes." "And you didn't consider that a conflict?" "I considered it a woman protecting her children," Vivian said. "Make of that what you want." Dennison paused. He had the experienced litigator's instinct for when a witness had given an answer that was better than what he was going to get if he pushed, and he moved on. He came to the rooftop. He walked her through it in detail. The text message, the stairwell, the helicopter, the meeting. He lingered on each element with the care of someone constructing an image in the jury's minds. And Vivian let him, because the image itself was not the problem. The image was just the image. What mattered was what you understood when you looked at it. "You had just finalized your divorce," Dennison said. "You were in an emotionally vulnerable state." "I wasn't," she said. He paused. "Excuse me?" "I wasn't in an emotionally vulnerable state," she said. "I had been preparing for that divorce for 8 months. I was very clear about what I wanted to do next. I went to that rooftop because I chose to, not because I was vulnerable." Dennison looked at her. He recalibrated. "Would you say," he said more carefully, "that Mr. Vale influenced your decisions during this period?" "He provided information," she said. "I made decisions." "He provided information gathered by a criminal organization.
He provided information that was accurate, she said. The accuracy of information doesn't change based on who gathered it.
$9.4 million moved from a children's surgical fund into a resort development. That's true whether Adrian Vale knows about it or whether I found it in a library. Dennison's jaw was very slightly tighter than it had been. Ms. Hale, he said, isn't it possible that you were manipulated by a very sophisticated, very powerful man into believing that what you were doing was justice, when in fact you were being used as the public-facing instrument of a criminal vendetta? The courtroom was quiet enough that she could hear the ventilation system. She looked at Dennison. Then she looked at the jury. 12 people in a box. 12 people who had been sitting with this for 5 days, who had heard the wire transfers and the shell companies, and Philip Gorst's quiet voice, and Marissa's flat hands in her lap. She looked at them the way she looked at anything she needed to understand, directly, without flinching. I've spent 22 years, she said, being told what I was doing and why I was doing it by a man who decided he knew my motivations better than I did. I know what it feels like to be managed. I know what it feels like to have someone else's version of your own choices presented to you as the true version. She paused. What I did in this investigation, I did because children didn't get surgeries. I did it because a man I was married to built his entire public identity on a fraud and used trust as a weapon for 2 decades. I did it because Sylvie Okafor was afraid for 3 years and finally wasn't. She looked at Dennison. You can call that manipulation if it serves your argument. It doesn't change what it was. Dennison said, no further questions. He sat down. The silence in the courtroom lasted exactly 3 seconds before Catherine Bale stood for redirect, and the machinery moved forward the way it did, relentless and indifferent and necessary. Vivian sat in the witness box and breathed. She had done what she said she would do. She had been present and honest, and she had not flinched at the part that was supposed to make her flinch. Whatever the jury decided now was the jury's to decide, and she had given them everything she had to give. She was escorted back to the gallery. She sat beside Leona. Leona looked at her once, briefly, and said nothing, but her expression said what needed to be said. Grant testified in his own defense on the 7th day. It was a mistake, and Clark Dennison had probably advised against it, but Grant Waverly had spent his entire life controlling rooms with his presence, and he believed, had always believed, would believe, until the specific moment that belief stopped serving him, that if he could just speak directly to the people in front of him, he could make them understand his version. He sat in the witness box in the same dark suit, and he was composed and articulate, and his voice was measured, and everything he said was technically in the form of an answer to a question, but it was really just the performance of a man who had performed for so long that he no longer knew how to do anything else. He said the word intent 17 times in 40 minutes. He said the funds were temporarily repositioned. He said the structure was complex but legitimate. He said that his former wife's association with dangerous individuals had colored the entire proceeding. Catherine Bale cross-examined him for 2 hours. She didn't raise her voice once. She asked questions in the same level, organized, relentless tone she used for everything. And each question was a document, a specific email, a specific transfer record, a specific date on which a specific amount had moved from a specific account to a specific destination. And each time Grant answered, the answer created the next question, and the next, and the next, until the room had the specific airless quality of a space in which someone is running out of options, and everyone can see it except the person running. At one point, Catherine Bale read him back his own email to Philip Gorst, dated March 2021, written at 11:40 p.m. Written at 4 sentences, and asked him to explain what he had meant by the phrase, "the kid's money can cover the gap until Q3. Grant said he did not recall writing that email. Bale said, "Your email address, your device, your home network's IP address, March 14th, 2021, 11:40 p.m. A pause. "You don't recall." Grant stopped. "I write a great many emails." "This one," Bale said, "was about $9.4 million from a pediatric surgical fund. I'd expect it to be memorable." The courtroom was very quiet. Grant looked at Clark Dennison. Dennison's face gave him nothing. He looked at the jury. The jury looked back at him with the patient, attentive expressions of 12 people who had been listening for 7 days and had already decided what they were looking at, and Grant Waverly understood, in that moment, the specific, irreversible quality of an audience that has finished being persuaded. He looked then across the courtroom. Vivian was sitting in the gallery with her hands in her lap and her mother's watch on her wrist, and her face carrying the specific expression of a woman who had already moved past the moment she was sitting inside, past the courtroom and the testimony and the emails and the counted millions, past all of it to whatever was on the other side of this, which was a life she had not yet built but could already see the shape of. Grant looked at her, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything. And in that silence was the complete summary of 22 years and everything those years had cost. Then Vivian looked away, not with anger, not with the performed indifference of someone making a point. She simply looked away the way you looked away from something that no longer required your attention, and opened the notebook in her lap to a blank page, and waited for whatever came next. The jury deliberated for 11 hours and 23 minutes. Vivian knew the number because she counted. Not obsessively. She wasn't watching a clock on a wall, wasn't refreshing a phone, but because she was present for all of it, sitting in the courthouse corridor on a wooden bench with bad back support, drinking coffee from a paper cup that had gone cold 2 hours in, and when the bailiff came out at 4:17 in the afternoon of the second day and said they had a verdict, she did the arithmetic automatically, the way she'd been doing arithmetic for months. It was a habit now. Everything had a number. Everything could be measured if you looked at it long enough. Leona was beside her. She stood first and offered her hand, not to help Vivian up, but just to offer it. And Vivian took it briefly and let go, and they went back into the courtroom together. Grant was already at the defense table when she came in. He was sitting very straight, which was not his natural posture. He had a tendency to lean slightly forward, the posture of a man accustomed to commanding whatever room he was in, and the straightness of his back now read as effort. As the physical expression of someone holding themselves in a shape they were no longer sure they could maintain. Clark Dennison was beside him, a legal pad on the table, a pen in his hand. The pen was capped. There was nothing left to write. Vivian sat in the gallery. She folded her hands in her lap. Her mother's watch was on her wrist. She'd worn it every day of the trial. The jury filed in. She watched their faces the way Leona had told her to watch them, not for smiles or frowns, which were unreliable, but for where they looked when they came through the door. Most of them looked at the judge. 2 looked at the floor. One, a woman in her 60s with close-cropped white hair who had been attentive through every day of testimony, looked directly at the prosecution table. Leona, beside her, exhaled very quietly. The foreperson was a man named, according to the court records, as Juror 7, a retired logistics manager from Queens who had asked the most precise questions during voir dire and had been, throughout the trial, the kind of juror who wrote things down. He stood with the verdict form and read it in a voice that was steady and entirely without drama, because the drama had already happened. It had happened in 7 days of testimony and 11 hours of deliberation, and the verdict form was just the record of what 12 people had concluded after sitting with all of it. Guilty. On 24 of the 26 counts. The 2 counts that came back not guilty were technical. A pair of conspiracy charges that required proof of a specific agreement on a specific date, and the documentation for those 2 specific dates had been among the material Philip Gorst's attorneys had negotiated out of his cooperation agreement. Dennison would call it a partial vindication in his statement to the press. The partial was doing a lot of work in that sentence. Grant received the verdict in the way he'd received everything for the past 8 days, with the controlled composure of a man who had decided that visible reaction was not available to him. His jaw tightened. That was all. His jaw tightened and he looked at the table and he did not look at Vivian. She had not expected him to. Ross Calder, sentenced separately in a proceeding that had run concurrent with Grant's trial, received his verdict in a courtroom 2 floors up at nearly the same time, 9 counts, guilty on 7. He would serve between 3 and 5 years depending on sentencing guidelines and cooperation credit. His attorney was already planning the appeal. Marissa received her plea agreement the same afternoon. 18 months suspended, with 3 years of probation and a financial penalty that represented approximately 60% of the direct monetary benefit she'd received through the Waverly accounts. Her attorney had negotiated hard for the suspension. Catherine Bale had agreed because Marissa's cooperation had been the first crack in the structure, and Bale was the kind of prosecutor who understood that the first crack was worth more than the punishment you got for making it. Outside the courthouse, on the wide granite steps, journalists positioned themselves with the specific urgency of people who need 45 seconds of usable footage before their competitor gets it. Vivian came out with Leona, and they walked down the steps together and stopped on the sidewalk, and the cameras came with them, and Vivian looked at the microphones extended toward her and took a breath. She had prepared something. 3 sentences, measured and complete. She had written them in the notebook and revised them twice, and they were, she believed, true and sufficient, and would close the public chapter of this thing without opening any new doors. She said, "The verdict today isn't about me or about my divorce or about anyone's personal history with Grant Waverly. It's about what happens to children when people entrusted with their care decide that the money meant for them is available for other purposes. I hope it answers that question clearly." A reporter called out, "Ms. Hale, what about your relationship with Adrian Vale? Do you have a response to the allegations that he orchestrated?" "I testified under oath about every aspect of that," she said. "The jury heard it. The jury decided. I don't have anything to add." She walked to the waiting car. Adrian was not at the courthouse. She hadn't expected him to be. He called that evening at 7, after she'd been home long enough to take off the dark blue suit and the watch and sit on her couch in old clothes with her shoes off and the notebook on the cushion beside her. Not open, just present. 24 counts, he said. Yes. A pause. How are you? She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she'd been thinking about things for months. Tired, she said, not sad, not relieved exactly, just the specific tiredness of something that took a long time being finished. That's accurate, he said. Ross Calder got 7, she said. Philip Gorst will be sentenced next month. The cooperation agreement caps him at 30 months. I know. The endowment, she said, the 3 funds, surgical, education, maternal health, the foundation's board has been restructured. The interim director is a woman named Carol Ashby who has been running pediatric nonprofit organizations for 20 years and has no prior relationship with anything connected to Grant. She paused. All 3 funds are being restored. The gap is being covered. I know, he said again. She looked at the notebook on the cushion. The anonymous trust, she said, the one that covered the 2 surgical cases during the investigation. Catherine Bale's office asked me if I knew the origin. What did you tell them? I told them I had a reasonable belief about the origin, but no documentary evidence. A pause. They accepted that. He was quiet for a moment. Adrian, she said, the amount that went into those 3 funds, the full restoration amount, it wasn't just the 9.4 from the surgical endowment, it was the full gap across all 3. Education, maternal health, surgical. She paused. That's closer to 30 million. A pause. The Children's Fund had gaps, he said. Gaps get filled. She closed her eyes briefly. He had said the same thing before, almost word for word, and she understood now that it was not a deflection. It was the complete statement. It was the whole of his accounting, expressed in 5 words. I need to ask you something, she said. Ask. Why her? She said. Why me? You had the information about Grant for 18 months. You could have taken it to a prosecutor directly. You could have built a case without a civilian face on it. It would have been cleaner, legally. A long pause, long enough that she thought he might not answer. Cleaner, he said. Yes, but it would have been mine. Another pause. A case built by my organization against a man who wronged a woman I never met. That's a power move. That's the Vale Network expanding its influence over legitimate institutions. That's what my enemies would say, and they wouldn't be entirely wrong. His voice was very even. What happened instead was that the woman he wronged built the case herself, with tools available to her, and the truth came from inside his world, not from mine. You gave me the tools, she said. You knew how to use them, he said. That's not the same as me giving you the outcome. She sat with that. Outside her window, the city was doing its thing, the way it always did, and she had stopped finding that indifference alienating. She had arrived somewhere on the other side of it, somewhere in which the city's continuity was not a rebuke to her pain, but simply the background against which her life was happening, large or small, known or unknown. The foundation board, she said. The interim director, Carol Ashby. Her appointment came through very quickly after the verdict. She's qualified, Adrian said. She is, Vivian said. Her last 3 positions were all with organizations connected to a philanthropic network that I looked into this afternoon. A pause. That network has received funding through a series of charitable vehicles whose origins are not simple to trace. Silence. Adrian. Carol Ashby, he said, is the best person available for that position. What she does with it will be her own work. Vivian understood that this was the complete answer and that pressing further would produce only more complete answers of the same kind. She accepted it. I'm going to the coast next week, she said. My mother's house. I haven't been there since the summer before the divorce. I know, he said. And then, because she was about to ask, you mentioned it in October. You said you hadn't been there in over a year. She had mentioned it. She remembered. She'd been standing at the window in Leona's office, and she'd said something about the coast and her mother's house as an example of things she hadn't done because she'd been managing the shape of her marriage. She hadn't thought he was paying that kind of attention. She was still learning what kind of attention he paid. There's work to do on the house, she said. It's been sitting. Do you want company? He said. The question was very simple and entirely without pressure, the way his questions were, and she held it for a moment. Not yet, she said. I need to go there alone first. Okay, he said. Bats. She drove up on a Tuesday morning in early March when the light on the coast had the particular quality of a winter that was just beginning to consider leaving. Still cold, still gray at the edges, but with a thinness to the gray that suggested something behind it. She drove herself. The security that had been around her since November had been stepped back at her request the week after the verdict, and she'd had 3 days of walking to the coffee shop alone and riding the elevator alone and sitting in her apartment alone. And it felt like taking off a coat she'd grown so accustomed to that she'd forgotten she was wearing it. The coast house was her mother's in the way that some things were entirely one person's. Not legally, not by inheritance, but in the deeper way of having been shaped by that person's specific presence until the shaping was permanent. Her mother had lived there for 30 years. She'd painted it 3 times, always the same color. A gray-white that changed through the day, darker in morning fog, almost luminous at midday. She'd planted the garden that was currently a mess of dead growth and brave early green. She'd hung the wind chimes on the porch that were still there, bent and salt-worn, making their quiet sound against the March air, when Vivian got out of the car and stood in the gravel driveway and looked at the house. She stood there for a while. Then she got her bag from the trunk and went inside. The house smelled like itself, salt and old wood, and the specific smell of a place that had been closed through the winter but had not gone cold inside in the way that empty houses sometimes did. She opened the windows in the kitchen and the front room. She made a fire. She made tea and sat at the kitchen table and didn't look at her phone and didn't open the notebook and didn't think about the trial or the verdict or the sentencing hearing scheduled for next month. She looked at the garden through the window. She thought about her mother, who had been a woman who grew things and fixed things, and did not make large statements about either activity, who had sat at this table with her own coffee and her own quiet and her own sense of what a life was supposed to contain. Who had told Vivian, when she'd announced the engagement to Grant with the particular brightness of someone performing happiness they were still working on feeling, that she hoped he knew what he had? She hadn't said anything else. She hadn't needed to. Vivian had thought, at the time, that the comment was a slightly awkward blessing. She understood now it was something else. Her mother had seen it from the first, not the outcome, not the fraud, or the mistress, or the parking garage, but the basic orientation of a man who looked at people and calculated their use. Her mother had seen it and said the one thing she could say without being dismissed as a mother who didn't want to let go. And then she'd let Vivian make her own choice. That was love that trusted its object. Vivian was still learning how to carry it. She spent 3 days pulling dead growth out of the garden. She didn't have the right gloves, and her hands were cold and sore by the end of the first afternoon, and she went inside and ran hot water over them and looked at the redness of her palms and felt, obscurely and without being able to fully explain it, that this was useful, that the soreness was a kind of confirmation that she was here, present, using her own hands for something that required them. On the third day she found, under a tangle of dead clematis along the south wall, the first green of the year, a small persistent crowd of something she'd always known the name of but kept forgetting, low to the ground, the green that had been there all winter under the dead growth, waiting. She sat on her heels in the cold and looked at it for a long time. The sentencing hearing was in April. Grant Waverly stood before the federal judge in the same dark suit he'd worn to the verdict, and Clark Dennison made the arguments he was paid to make: the charitable work, the decades of service, the absence of prior criminal record, the argument that a man of Grant's age and profile serving a full sentence would serve no deterrent purpose that a lesser sentence would not equally serve. Catherine Bale made her arguments. Then the judge spoke. He was a man in his late 60s who had been on the federal bench for 22 years and had the particular quality of judges who had heard every version of every argument and had arrived at a place where what they valued above all else was precision. He spoke for 14 minutes. He went through the counts. He addressed, specifically, the children's surgical endowment, and he used a word that Vivian had not heard in any of the proceedings up to that point. He called it predatory. He said that the deliberate redirection of funds entrusted for the care of children was not a complex financial misjudgment, but a predatory act, and that the sentence would reflect that characterization. Grant Waverly received 9 years in federal prison, parole eligibility at 6, with conditions that included permanent removal from any position of charitable or fiduciary trust, mandatory financial restitution monitored by the court, and a prohibition on any involvement with nonprofit organizations for the remainder of his life. The restitution amount was $31.7 million. He was taken into custody the same day. Vivian watched it from the gallery. She had not prepared any expression for this moment. She had specifically not prepared one, because she had decided that whatever she felt when it happened was what she was allowed to feel, and she wasn't going to manage it in advance. What she felt, when the bailiff moved to Grant's side and Grant stood and the handcuffs appeared, was something she didn't have a precise word for. Not satisfaction, not grief. Something closer to the feeling at the end of a very long road when you've arrived somewhere real and can finally stop walking. Not joy exactly, but the specific relief of no longer being in motion. She looked at Grant one last time as they took him out. He didn't look back. She hadn't expected him to. She had stopped expecting things from him a long time ago, and in the stopping she had recovered something she hadn't known was missing. The energy she'd spent for years anticipating his reactions, managing his perceptions, adjusting herself to the shape of his requirements. That energy was hers again. She was still figuring out what to do with all of it. Outside the courthouse, on the same granite steps where she'd stood in November after the divorce, she stopped. Reporters were there, not as many as before. The verdict had been the peak of the coverage. The sentencing was the footnote, and the world had already begun moving to the next thing, the way the world did. A few cameras turned her way. She didn't make a statement. She had said what she had to say. She looked at the steps, and then at the street, and then at the sky, which was April now, which was different from January, less committed to its grayness, willing to let light through in the late afternoon in a way that changed the look of the city, made it softer at the edges without making it false. Her phone buzzed. Leona. Good outcome. Go home. Rest. Her phone buzzed again. A number she recognized. Dan Forsyth. Drinks? We survived. She smiled at that. Not the careful, managed expression she'd been wearing in public for months, but an actual smile, the kind that used her eyes. She typed back. Next week. I owe you several. Then she put the phone in her bag and walked down the steps to the street. She drove back to the coast 2 weeks later, this time with Leona, who turned out to be someone who knew how to be quiet in the way that made quiet feel like company rather than absence. They ate dinner at the kitchen table the first night and opened a bottle of wine that Vivian had bought specifically for a moment of completion, though she hadn't known which moment when she'd bought it. And they talked about things that were not the trial: Leona's daughter, who was applying to colleges, the garden progress, the wind chimes. And at some point, the conversation simply stopped in the way that conversation stopped between people who were comfortable, and they sat with the sound of the water and the chimes and the March becoming April night, and it was enough. Leona went back to the city Sunday afternoon. Vivian stayed. She began, that week, the work of converting the property into what it would become. Not alone. She had a contractor, a woman named Bess, who had grown up on the coast and knew which walls were load-bearing and which ones were just studs and drywall and habit. They worked through the house together, room by room, figuring out what the space needed to be, what it wanted. The idea had come to her in the garden when she'd found the green under the dead growth. Not as a plan, exactly, more as an understanding of what was already true. Her mother's house had always been a place where people came when they needed to think. Her mother had had that quality. People arrived at her kitchen table with things they didn't know how to carry and left with a better sense of the weight. The house had absorbed it. The house still had it. She filed the nonprofit paperwork in May. The organization was called the Hale Foundation, which was her mother's name as well as hers. Eleanor Hale, who had sat at a coastal kitchen table for 30 years and grown things and fixed things and trusted her daughter to make her own choices and live with them. The foundation's stated purpose: a residential retreat for families of children undergoing long-term medical treatment. Free of charge, indefinitely, through a combination of the organization's own fundraising and a substantial endowment that had been established, quietly, through channels that were cleanly structured and entirely above board, set up by an attorney who worked with a firm that had no visible connection to anything or anyone that would complicate the paperwork, in the foundation's first week of existence. Vivian did not ask Adrian directly about the endowment. She had learned, slowly, that there were things he did that did not require her acknowledgement, and that asking for his acknowledgement of them would change what they were. He didn't give to be thanked. He gave because the gap existed and he had the means to fill it, and asking him to own that publicly would make it about the giving rather than about what was given to. She understood him better than she had expected to. She was still not sure she fully understood him. She thought that might be permanent, and she was not, she realized, bothered by it. He came to the coast in June. He arrived on a Saturday morning in a car, not a helicopter, and knocked on the front door, and she opened it, and he was standing on the porch with the salt air behind him and the wind chimes doing their slow business overhead, and she looked at him for a moment. "The garden looks different," he said. "I've been working on it." "I can see that." He looked past her into the house, not intrusively, just the natural look of someone assessing a space they're being invited into. "Can I come in?" "Yes," she said. He came in. He moved through the front room slowly, looking at what had been done. The refinished floors, the new windows, the photographs of her mother on the wall that Vivian had put up last month after years of keeping them in a box. He stopped at one of them. Her mother in the garden, younger than Vivian was now, laughing at something off camera with the complete ease of someone entirely at home in their own life. "She looks like you," he said. "I look like her," Vivian said. "There's a difference." The corner of his mouth moved. "Yes," he said. "There is." She made coffee and they sat at the kitchen table and looked out at the garden in the June light. There was a lot that could have been said, and neither of them said most of it, because most of it was already understood, and what wasn't understood yet was still becoming, and pressing it into words too soon would do what premature words always did: fix it in a shape it hadn't finished taking. He told her, at some point over the coffee, that Clark Dennison had filed the first of what would be several appeals on Grant's behalf. She told him she knew. He said the appeals had a low probability of success given the strength of the documentary evidence. She said Leona had told her the same. He said nothing else about it, and she appreciated that he understood the trial was finished and the verdict was real, and the appeals were Dennison's procedure, not her life. She told him about the first family that was going to use the retreat in August. Parents of a 7-year-old boy named Marcus, who was 3 months into a treatment protocol at a hospital an hour north, and who had been living out of a motel with a weekly rate that was consuming everything they had. She told him about the room she'd set up for the boy. Low shelves, window seat, the specific height of things arranged for a child who would be there during treatment, who might be tired, who might need the window more than the floor. Adrian listened. He listened the way he listened to everything, completely, without interjection, with the quality of attention that was rare enough that you noticed it when it was given to you. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Your mother would have approved," he said. Vivian looked at the photograph on the wall. Her mother laughing in the garden, entirely at home. "Yes," she said. "She would have." They sat with the coffee and the sound of the water and the chimes, and the morning moved forward around them the way mornings did. Neither fast nor slow, neither caring nor indifferent, just the actual passage of time in the actual world, which was all any morning ever was, and which, Vivian had found, was enough. The letter came in September. It was postmarked from the federal correctional facility where Grant was serving his sentence, a minimum security installation in upstate New York, which Dennison had negotiated through the sentencing process as appropriate, given Grant's age and nonviolent history. It arrived in a standard envelope. Grant's handwriting on the outside, her name and the coastal address, forwarded from the city apartment she'd kept but visited less and less. She held it for a long time before she did anything with it. She had not heard from him since the courthouse. She had not expected to. She had not expected the letter either, and the surprise of it was not emotional so much as it was structural. She had believed, somewhere in herself, that the ending of something this large would have a clean edge, a clear line, where the before stopped and the after began. Instead, there was this: an envelope in September light, his handwriting, the weight of whatever he'd decided she needed to hear. She thought about what was probably inside it. The word closure appeared in her mind, and she noted it the way she noted things that weren't useful. She thought about apology, which could be real or could be the performance of apology, and she had no interest in spending the energy required to determine which this one was. She thought about what it would cost her to read it. Not much, probably. And what it would give her. Nothing she didn't already have. She took the letter to the fire pit at the edge of the garden, where she burned dead growth at the end of each week. She set a fire with 2 pieces of newspaper and 2 sticks from the pile beside it, the way her mother had taught her. Paper, small wood, larger wood, let it find its own level. And she held the letter over it without opening it. She had thought once that she would want this moment to mean something, that she would stand here and feel the specific weight of all of it and release it in a way that would be legible as release. But what she felt was more ordinary than that. She was slightly cold, her hands smelled like wood smoke. The garden behind her was doing what September gardens did, which was beginning the long negotiation between what was finishing and what was still going, and none of it was asking her to perform anything. She let the letter go. The fire was efficient and brief, the way fires were. She stood there for a while after, not thinking about anything in particular, just being in the body she lived in the garden that was becoming itself, in the life she was building with her own hands and no one else's direction, and feeling the particular quality of the September evening on the coast, which had a brightness to it despite the hour, a refusal of early darkness, as if the light was holding on not dramatically, but simply because it hadn't finished yet. She heard the car in the driveway. She didn't go to check. She knew the sound of it. She stayed at the fire pit and listened to the car door and the footsteps on the gravel, and then the quiet. The pause that was Adrian, always. The moment before he moved into a space. The half-beat of a man who had learned to enter things carefully because entering things carelessly had consequences he'd lived with. Then his footsteps on the garden path. He came to stand beside her at the fire pit. He looked at the embers. He didn't ask what had burned. She didn't explain it. They stood together in the September light at the edge of the garden, and the chimes made their sound from the porch, and somewhere north of them, a child named Marcus was 3 months further into his treatment, and his parents were sleeping in a real bed for the first time in months. In the room with the low shelves and the window, and the Waverly Foundation was Carol Ashby's now, doing the work it had always claimed to do, and Philip Gorst was 12 months into a 30-month sentence, and Ross Calder was filing paperwork for his first parole hearing, and Sylvie Okafor was back in her own city with her children and a new position at a clean organization, and Marissa was building something she hadn't told anyone about yet in a city 3 states away. And the world was moving forward in its indifferent way, continuous and necessary. And inside all of that continuity, Vivian Hale was standing at the edge of her mother's garden with wood smoke on her hands, and a man beside her who had never once told her what to do with her own life. And this was the ending. Not clean, not a line where the before stopped, just the actual evening, arriving at its own pace, neither rushed nor slow, and the light holding on the way light did when it hadn't finished yet. She reached out and put her hand in his. He held it. They stood there while the fire went down to ash, and the garden breathed around them, and the water made its sound in the dark distance, and neither of them needed to say anything about any of it, because the things that mattered had already been done. In courtrooms and kitchens and parking garages and rooftops and garden paths, in every choice made at the edge of a difficult thing. And what was left was simply this: being present in the life that all of it had made possible. The light finally went. The chimes moved in the evening air. And Vivian Hale, who had been quiet in a way that cost her everything, and then loud in a way that cost her nothing she wasn't willing to spend, stood in the dark that was her own dark. The dark she had chosen, in the home she was building, beside a man she had not been rescued by, but had simply, imperfectly, honestly found and breathed.